Welcome to the history of Brighton Hippodrome, which conveniently can be told in 7 ages of the finest surviving circus theatre in the country, whatever it looks like from outside. We begin, however, by a happy connection to the very beginning of theatre in Brighton. The first permanent theatre was here, where shown by the arrow in North Street. It's roughly where Burger King is now. And it was built in 1774 by a man called Samuel Payne. The picture shows the next theatre that was built in the next street, around the back of North Street, in Duke Street. And it's not quite sure what it looked like, but this is one or other of these pictures is probably a pretty good representation of what Payne's first theatre looked like. Payne had a number of properties in the Old Town area, including this one at number 44 Middle Street. He had a son who in 1784 opened a school in this building, and it was almost certainly this one. It was described as a new and well-built brick and stone house with 7 bedrooms, a large schoolroom, 2 parlours, a shop, kitchen, scullery, 2 cellars, a coal vault, walled-in yard, and quarter share of a draw well. However, the school had gone by the end of the century, and it then became the home of George Wigney of the Ship Street Brewery, and brother of one of the first MPs for Brighton, who was elected after the 1832 Reform Act. When he died in 1847, his widow sold the business to Vallance and Catt, the brewers in West Street, and Charles Catt of that firm took over Middle Street as a house of his own, and he stayed there for 46 years. Now, why is this relevant? Well, there it is on the map, and you can see here the curtilage of the Hippodrome as it is today. And it includes, on the right-hand side of that image, on the east side, there is a mews that have various tradesmen in there. And down towards the southern end, there are Middle Street cottages. Now, there are no pictures of Middle Street cottages, but they probably looked something like this, which is across the other side of Middle Street. And this is the view looking along Boyce's Street. It's the earliest photograph showing anything of the Hippodrome. Number 44 was renumbered in 1882 as number 52, for which in 1887, the very prolific local architect Samuel Denman designed a couple of conservatories. And remember that shape, the rather octagonal shape. This was the site then which became the basis for a skating rink. Ellis and Humphrey Bramwell were a father and son. Ellis owned a theatre in Liverpool, and this was probably their first venture down into the south. They chose an architect called Lewis Carslake of Carslake and Mortimer. Mortimer had died the previous year, and this was really one of the last jobs that Carslake himself did. And what he designed was, in this site, there is a rink on the southern side, and then all the machinery was up towards the north. And it was essentially a circular rink inside a roughly square building. The skating rink had a 98-foot diameter. It had a tea room, it had a ladies' room, and various other facilities around the edges. It had an entrance on the southern end, on the right of that picture, and an exit on the northern side. And the way it was designed is around the rink, he put up 16 pillars, which supported a glazed dome. The pillars were on, the girders stood on pillars and connected to a circular ring just below the top of the dome. So we have the skating rink. And here is the facade. It is essentially the way it is now, except that the fenestration has changed fairly considerably. But the towers, the entrances on either side are very much the same. And you can see here how extensive the site was. The Brighton Ice Skating Syndicate Limited not only had the skating rink at the southern end of this, it's an insurance map actually, and at the top there is the ice freezing room, and next to it there's a cold room with a tank and an engine house. And then there was a club room at number 52, and between the rink and the club room was the winter garden, which was Denman's conservatories. It was announced on the front page of national newspapers, including the Morning Post. This was a little bit after it opened, at the end of 1897, and you can see that it's advertising the prices for morning, afternoon, and evening skating. 2 and 6 in the afternoon, 4 shillings in the afternoon, 2 and 6 in the morning and evening. And there was also a fancy dress ball scheduled for the 7th of January 1898. Those prices suggest that it was probably going to be people who could actually afford to get dressed up nicely. Incidentally, that on that first ad at the top there, the National Skating Palace, Hengler's, was soon to become the London Palladium, so another skating rink that became a theatre. It didn't really help that the National Skating Association held its first competition, international competition, at the Brighton rink, and the Victorians' idea of skating was outdoor. There had been a craze for indoor skating in the 1870s, in which Brighton was actually one of the pioneers, but this was not really what they fancied, and so the skating rink failed by 1900, partly also because of the grand skating rink, which in West Street, which was adopting the imported American craze for roller skating. So Bramall had the idea that he had this circular skating rink, why not convert it into a circus? And he commissioned the great Frank Matcham, the best theatre architect of his period. And he has a lot of theatres to his credit. If you want to pause at any time, you can go back and look at those. He built well over, or was certainly well over 120 theatres, of which 24 only are still standing. And the Hippodrome is the only one that's derelict. In Brighton, he built the Eden, which changed its name to the Grand in 1887. That's at the top end of North Road, where Brighthelm is now. He also built this one on the seafront, the Alhambra Opera House and Music Hall, which in 1912 became the Palladian Cinema, and it's now underneath the site of Brighton Centre. And what he designed was this. You can see that he's put in stables on the north side and the circus ring with a stage next to it. But he's kept most of the original front of house at the bottom end of that plan that was put there by Carslake. He designed some new doors because if you're going to have a large number of people going in and out in short time, you need to have a lot of doors. And so he put in 4 more doors in addition to the 2 that were already there. The reason that the seating doesn't follow the line of the ring puzzled me until I discovered that in fact it was a secondary orchestra pit. He turned what had been the ladies' retiring room, I suppose you could call it, into a crush bar, a crush room at the front. And he put in a new lobby behind that with access to the boxes at the back of the auditorium. He built an equestrian ramp, which is still there, on the way from the stables into the ring. And this is what it looked like. You can see the stage beyond the circus ring, and on either side of the stage are animal entrances. The stage had a 42-foot diameter, which apparently is the minimum turning circle of a galloping horse. Very useful bit of information, that. And this is what it looked like on the outside. Something I've only just discovered is that these finials on the canopy actually lit up at night. It must have been really rather a spectacular place. And you can see in that picture, there are the 6 doors along the front of the building. So a very spectacular piece of Matcham plasterwork, most of which is still there and in reasonable condition, although it does need to be looked at. The reason for the scaffolding is to make sure it's still there and protected. But this wonderful dome, and you can see it's got a gallery up above it, and the edges of the balconies are most elaborately designed, the top of the boxes and above the stage. And there is a wonderful glow about it. There's something about Matcham theatres that it really is quite special. And so it became a circus. And these are a couple of the first week acts. John Macaulay was an Irish tenor, and the Flying Zidoras look pretty much what they were. And here, a couple of weeks later, Herr Grace came with his performing baboon. But the circus didn't thrive, and after 51 weeks, it closed. The property was repossessed. The Bramwells had not been doing very well. They were not very good businessmen. And so it was repossessed and put up for auction in October 1902. And the description is very, very comprehensive, actually. It's one of the most handsome palaces of amusement in the kingdom. A long description of it there, and then lower down where the arrow's pointing, it says it was ventilated by means of a sliding roof and heated by steam. And that sliding roof is still there. There are only 4 of them left in the country, and it looks as though this one will have to go. It's in a bad condition. But there we are. And despite the fact that it came not only with the theatre, the circus, but with 52 Middle Street that we've talked about, and on the other side of the entrance yard was number 50 Middle Street, another cottage, but it failed to sell. And it wasn't until a private treaty was agreed with Thomas Beresford that it changed hands. Now, Beresford had started out in the catering and hospitality trade up in the northeast, and got into theatre when he took over a wooden circus in Jarrow in 1895. But his big breakthrough came when he acquired the Leeds Tivoli in 1899. He renamed it the Leeds Hippodrome, and he was one of the pioneers of twice nightly variety. He built up over a period of 4 years a chain of 14 theatres. This was part of his advertising, his calling card, that listed some of the theatres before he got the Brighton theatre. But he liked the Brighton one so much that he actually moved down here. And he employed another well-known, important theatre architect, Bertie Crewe, to come and do the conversion from a circus into a variety theatre. And that's what he did. He put in a raked floor with seating running down towards the stage. He extended the apron, that's the area in front of the proscenium arch, and put in a bigger orchestra pit. And he put in 2 boxes on either side where the animal entrances had been. And it's interesting, Beresford was very much in an acquisitive period. And in 1902, he took over the Empire Theatre of Varieties in New Road, opposite the Pavilion Gardens, renamed it the Coliseum Theatre of Varieties. So he had 2 variety theatres. But in 1908, it became the Court Theatre and Buffet, and then almost immediately afterwards, the Court Picture Palace, as you can see above the big name there. And so we come to this most important period when it was a variety theatre. That's how it looked when it opened just in time for Christmas on the 22nd of December 1902. These are some of the acts in the first week. You can see there are still animal acts there, but this time on stage rather than in a circus ring. The ground floor of Hippodrome House, that northern part of the site, was turned into a lounge for teas in 1910. The doors are still there. That's the photograph I took of it. And there was a kiosk selling sweets and tobacco, no doubt, in Hippodrome House. But unfortunately, maybe all that exertion, that acquisitiveness, led to Beresford suffering a really serious illness towards the end of 1909, and he died on the 1st of February 1910. And you can see the enormous crowds that gathered to see the coffin being brought out of his home in Hippodrome House. His widow sold the business to Walter de Vries, who had a company called the South of England Hippodrome. And you can see here in a cigarette card, Mr. and Mrs. Walter de Vries. Mrs. Walter de Vries was actually better known as Vesta Tilley, where she was topping the bill at the Hippodrome in 1911, as she did on a number of other occasions. Almost immediately, de Vries merged his chain with Alfred Butt's chain to form the Variety Theatre's controlling company. In 1915, they employed a London architect, Emlyn Walker, to upgrade the auditorium and the stage house. He reorganized the seating and had 2 aisles. It looks there as though there are 3, but in fact there were only 2 functional ones. And he did other work in the stage house, extending the backstage facilities. But one of the most important things he did was to move the proscenium arch forward by a short distance. And that meant that from the yellow line to the red line, and that meant that the wings became much more capacious, which was quite important. He added a fly tower, which wasn't really there, and he extended upwards from the top of what had been the stage, and he put in a grid, which is the piece of mechanism over which the ropes are twined in order to pull scenery up and down. He also put in some new boxes. So to replace Crewe's single deck ones, he put in double deck ones, which are the ones that are still there now. All of this, remarkably, though necessarily unsightly, was done without missing a single performance, which I think is unbelievable. Meanwhile, you'll have noticed that the date has crept on to 1915. And somewhere in France, there was a conflict going on. Now, you thought Warhorse was a new idea. Well, sorry, Michael Morpurgo. Warhorse was back there in the trenches during the First World War, because, of course, concert parties were being sent out. And some of them came from the Brighton Hippodrome. They were organized by the Hippodrome manager, Billy Boardman, and you can see a train load of them at Brighton Station being sent off to the front by the committee, which included, for the moment, Nellie Wigley and Johnny Lass, a couple of the performers who appeared in January 1916 when the picture was taken. After the war, in 1919, that tea room in the ground floor of Hippodrome House was turned into a palm court. They applied to get a liquor license and had problems getting it, but they did eventually. And from January 1923, they ran Thé Dansant there. Now, theatres couldn't open on Sundays, but cinemas in Brighton, not Hove, could. And so they put on film shows to keep the theatre going 7 days a week. And there it is, as it was in 1922. I think it looks really rather pretty with the hanging baskets and so on. Very inviting. The theatre was advertised with posters all over the place. That was at Poole Valley. This is the one coming in next to the new Patcham bypass. And there were stunts like this one of the elephants arriving at the station. I don't know whether the elephants did have season tickets. They might have done, because there were a number of circuses came surprisingly late on, really, considering it was only on the stage. And if you remember that lovely London to Brighton in 4 minutes film that the BBC used to use as an interlude, shot in August 1949. And how do we know that? Because this, when the train arrives at the platform, is the poster that you see. The Variety Theatres controlling company sold the Hippodrome to the General Theatre Corporation, which was almost immediately acquired by what was mainly a cinema operation, the British Picture Corporation. And the General Theatre Corporation part merged with Moss Empires and retained its own identity for quite a long time, until after the Second World War, when it did start to be called the Moss Hippodrome. Across the road from the Hippodrome in Middle Street, there was this garage for the patrons, designed by Stavers Tiltman, who is best known for the terminal building at Shoreham Airport. And it was used from 1941 to 1947 as an indoor, there was a radio program called Happy Drome from 1941 to 1947. So that name was used for an indoor funfair across the road. It later became a post office garage for their vans. You can see the facade is changing a little bit, quite subtly at this stage. And that is the curtilage of the Hippodrome as it was up to December 1954, when Moss Empires bought the land running through the Mews to Ship Street. The Mews was cleared, and the idea was to extend the back of the Hippodrome, and they employed an architect, E.M. Lawson, from Newcastle, who later went on to do the Talk of the Town in London, in another Hippodrome, but he also designed the television studios for Tyne Tees and Border up in the region where he operated. And what he did was to extend the stage house and the fly tower, which is what you see now when you look from Ship Street. And he took that basic plan of the stage, which you see here, in the version that he did, but this is how it had been before. So you can see how much he'd extended it, which was a particular benefit, increasing the size, so that the stage is now in the upper half of the range of theatres' sizes in the West End. The rest of the site became a car park, and it was also used for advertising like that. And there it is when it was a car park for the bingo patrons. The audiences at the Hippodrome were very mixed. You can see from the prices that you can have a stage box for 25 shillings, which was quite a lot of money then, and going right down to 9p if you sat in the circle at the sides. You wouldn't have had the greatest view of the stage. You certainly wouldn't be able to see to the back of the stage, but it was only 9p, so pretty well anyone could go. But the audiences tended to be not just mixed, but a little bit middle class, and some of them were really rather swank, shall we say, as this description. Miss Maud Longden had Mrs. Tizard with her, and her pretty daughter, Miss Tizard, Miss Longden wearing a very handsome kimono wrap, a black satin, richly embroidered in oriental design and colouring, Mrs. Tizard looking distinguée in black, and honestly. However, royalty came. The Duchess of Fife, as you will know, was the daughter of King Edward VII, and she and her husband lived on the corner of Lewis Crescent. They probably came because the Duchess's full name was Louisa Alexandra Dalmar, named after her Danish aunts. And the top of the bill that day when they came in 1903 was a performer called Alexandra Dalmar. Alfred Vanderbilt came for a charity performance. You'll see in a minute that charity was very important at the theatre. On the 2nd of May 1912, to raise money for the victims of the Titanic. He had a particular reason to do that because he booked a seat on the, booked a cabin on the Titanic, and had changed his mind at the last minute. Unfortunately, he didn't change his mind in 1915 when he booked a ticket on the Lusitania. And the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, came after playing a round of golf in Worthing in 1921. I said that charity was very important and the quality did get involved. These are 3 quality performers of the era. And they took part in a charity one-night only performance called the Persian Garden, but it was actually organized by these 2 ladies. And they were ladies. One was Lady George Cholmondeley. The other was Mrs. Walter Rubens. Mr. Walter Rubens wrote musicals. He was a composer. And there were more titles in the cast than you'd get in an average theatre program. So the stars and the shows, I won't talk very much. I think we'll have to come back and do that on another occasion. But this is the earliest picture of a show at the Hippodrome. It was in 1903, a show called The Trip to Paris, or The Honeymoon. And it was a scene from reenacting the Paris exhibition of 1900. And you can see it's really rather elaborate. This is the earliest known poster. Harry Houdini, who actually came back several times over the next few years. But the shows at that time always included animated pictures, not just because they could, as they did later on Sundays, but because this was a regular part of the show. And they often showed local films. And Beresford, of course, always looking for promotional opportunities, called his the Baroscope. In 1931, the BBC did the first of their outside broadcasts, and this is the typical van. The Masters of Nuremberg, surprisingly, was the first. It was an opera, not a variety performance at all, and it was conducted by Sir John Barbirolli, not then knighted. Henry Hall was a regular visitor to the theatre, and he broadcast his radio programs on the Light program. And mainly after the war, there were extracts from the pantos, and then from the summer season shows as well, nearly always introduced by Brian Johnston, sort of down your way. But the Hippodrome was part of the experience of going to Brighton as much as having fish and chips or jellied eels or oysters. And there was the name on the top of the theatre, just to remind you. On the left, by the way, that's the original Middle Street School. And that's the way it looked in 2015, when the dormer windows have been added in 1992, so not part of the original. And this, of course, is what Middle Street looks like now, rather forlorn and not very busy, compared with 60 years ago when people were queuing for tickets to see the summer season show. And you might guess from that program cover who the star was. It was, of course, Frankie Vaughan. And the summer seasons and the pantos were the shows that really were the bread and butter of the theatre. They each lasted, the pantos for 5 weeks, the summer seasons anything up to 9 or 10 weeks. But by the end of the 1950s, by 1960, the variety shows had become much less popular. Television probably made a difference. Sunday night at the London Palladium had taken over, and so pop music was really essentially took over variety. And of course, the Beatles. Now, what was important about the Beatles, and there you can see them obviously in Brighton because the policeman's wearing a white helmet, as they did then. And you can see he's still wearing a white helmet when this picture of them on stage was taken. For Beatles monthly, and all the bits of litter that look as though they're on the stage, I believe, are jelly babies. But what's important about this is that it provided not just pictures of them on stage, but also backstage. No luxurious dining room for the Beatles backstage at Brighton. They had to make do with a narrow dressing table along one wall of the room. And there it is. I hope, really, it's still there because it's quite a museum piece. Shortly after their last performance, the theatre was used for a feature film called Be My Guest. Some scenes are shot in the Dome, but the best ones are in the Hippodrome. And you can see here the view from the stage as seen in that film. And it also went down below. You can see in the back of that shot, there's the spiral staircase that came down from the stage. And there are scenes of the backstage area. And this is a view of what it would have looked like for performances looking from the circle. And full marks for anybody who recognizes the act. Pause to let you think. It was the Nashville Teens. The last near summer show, it didn't run for very long, only 12 days, was putting on the Donegan with Mark Winter in the show. The theatre was closed for 14 out of the first 42 weeks of that year, which is rather a lot. There they are, all crossed out. Now, can the council save the day? The reason for that question is because Lewis Cohen had been tipped off by his friend, the estate agent Edward Erdman, that the Moss Empires might be thinking of selling. He told the planning committee to consider this possibility. And so it was resolved that the further consideration of the matter be deferred, and the borough surveyor instructed to report to the next meeting with a view to the committee recommending the council to acquire the Hippodrome. Now, what an interesting idea that was. The borough surveyor didn't know what to suggest, and indeed the entertainments and publicity department said it's not for sale, which actually proved to be correct. Various departments suggested it could be a winter garden or a planetarium. The top answer was to turn it into a municipal theatre, which a lot of towns around the country were actually doing at that time. And this was the idea put forward by the Regency Society, among others, and the Theatre's Advisory Council, the forerunner of the Theatre's Trust. But the Director of Entertainments and Publicity thought it would be an idea, but a waste of time to think about it. And the last word came from the town clerk, W.O. Dodd. I frankly do not see why Brighton ratepayers should pour money into a venue of popular entertainment, which demonstrably is not popular. And I have no illusions that it is within the competence of the Brighton Corporation to provide entertainment economically of a popular character that will fill the Hippodrome where Moss Empires of late years have not succeeded. There was a report, 2 pages of foolscap, closely typed by the planning department, who proposed demolition of a multi-storey car park. The last show on the 22nd of November 1964 featured the 2 great rockers, Chuck Berry and Jerry Lewis, and full marks, if you remember, Twinkle and her record, her one-hit wonder, Terry, Death by Motorcycle. Around the time that it closed, Lou Grade's ATV bought Stoll Moss, that's the Stoll Theatre Corporation and Moss Empires, which by then were joined together. And in 1965, Lou Grade's brother, Bernard Delfont, came down to have a look at the possibility of turning it into a nightclub like Talk of the Town. Bernard Delfont, incidentally, had appeared at the Hippodrome as a dancer for a number of, on a number of occasions from 1928 to 1937. And by 1943, he was producing shows that were put on there. Nothing came of that idea about the Talk of the Town, by the way. And so in 19 1966, it was briefly taken over by a company called World Colour Services, and a flat floor was put in for it to be used for film and television production. But the company didn't really make a go of it, and the building was repossessed. And in 1967, the fifth age begins, when it was leased to Mecca Bingo, a pretty fancy bingo hall. And this curious structure appears to date from about 1972. It was in part of Hippodrome House, and there was a bar behind. It was later blocked off, so it really didn't serve much purpose. Oh, but you can see how popular the bingo was. And indeed, when there was a suggestion again that in 1974 that Mecca might give it up, they said no, it's the last one they would get rid of. In 1980, it was listed Grade 2 star by English Heritage. And in 1994, Mecca included a mezzanine floor halfway up the proscenium, but they did manage to match on the edge of it the plasterwork around the rest of the circle. But on the 8th of August 2006, the bingo closed. And that was the last time the Hippodrome was in use. So we now come on to the period from 2006 of heritage at risk. The freehold had been bought in 2003 by a company called London Merchant Securities for 1.6 million. Now, LMS also owned Duke's Lane. They changed their name to Derwent London. And in 2007, at the end of January, they valued Duke's Lane and the Hippodrome together at 13.1 million. A couple of weeks later, Academy Music Group, whose principal shareholder is the American concert promoter, Live Nation, took out a 30-year lease. That seems to have done something to increase the value, because when Derwent sold it with Duke's Lane in September, only 8 months after their valuation, they'd had a 50% increase in the valuation. It was sold to a company called Cheval Properties. Allied Irish banks had put up the money for it and included it in an investment package for their Irish clients. But it was not a good time to buy, because you will remember that around about that time, there was a serious financial crash and the value of property fell, which had consequences later. Also in 2007, the Theatres Trust included the Hippodrome in its list of theatres at risk. And indeed, it's been number one on the list since 2013. The reason for being number one is not because it is the one that's most run down and most derelict, but because it's the one that could actually be most readily brought back into public use. But 5 years later, in 2012, Academy Music Group abandoned its plans for the music venue. They ran into trouble with the idea of having a late night liquor license. And they came forward with an idea for an 8-screen multiplex cinema with 4 restaurants. And it's hard to believe, isn't it? And that's the way it was going to be organized. And this was the Ship Street frontage. There had been a scheme to build, this was where the car park, the yard was, the back of the theatre. There had been a scheme to build an office block there in 1989, but that had been withdrawn. And this was the Middle Street view next to Hippodrome House, literally the view. It was going to be a view cinema with an atrium complete with Alexander Calder Mobile. And that's when the campaign began. That idea did not go down very well. And so Gavin Henderson organized a public meeting on the 20th of October 2013 in the Friends Meeting House, standing room only, despite the fact that it was bucketing down with rain. And the campaign built from there by our Brighton Hippodrome, some person there speaking out, and there were rallies in New Road near the Theatre Royal, speakers saying, you know, this is the last chance, 20,000 signatures, and a lot of media coverage, including Caroline Lucas, who's been very much supportive of the idea of restoration, and Norman Cook, Fatboy Slim, the same. However, the council gave planning consent for the multiplex cinema and the restaurants in November 2014, but almost immediately the cinema scheme fell apart and the Duke's Lane and the Hippodrome went on the market. It was bought, the Hippodrome, not Duke's Lane, was bought by Academy Music Group, which still had a lot of its lease, still, I think 22 years still to run. And by the following year, the Brighton Hippodrome CIC, the Community Interest Company, of which I and Gavin Henderson are two of the directors, had a plan in place, a business plan with a development partner. However, the building was continuing to dilapidate. As you can see, it's not in the best condition, although it's still a magnificent place. You can see the plasterwork that's still there mostly, although the scaffolding was put in to protect it, to make sure, I mean, it doesn't last forever. And you can see how, you know, things had to be propped up. And there is, you know, serious degradation of the plasterwork, and the rooms are pretty terrible. There is the site, and around it, you can see you remember that conservatory, that bit is still there. There's the so-called Elephant House, which was all that was left of the stables. There are some pretty awful light wells. And there is that a view looking from ground level. By 2016, everything was very overgrown. And the facade, which had been still, you know, open as it had been for many years past, had to be boarded up because graffiti started to appear and spreading across onto the school across the road. So what is going to happen in future? One of the problems is the ownership. I've already mentioned several changes of ownership that occurred, up to Academy Music Group buying it in 2016. The following year, we had been, that is the CIC, had been trying to negotiate with our partner to acquire it, but it was sold to a company called Hippodrome Investments in 2017. In 2020, however, it was bought by Maxim Properties, who have started doing repairs, which is wonderful news. It means that the theatre could have a chance of surviving after all these years of dereliction. The CIC has existed since 2015 and has raised over £107,000 to pay for various reports, surveys, architectural work, and so on. And the first of which was a report by Colliers International for stakeholders, which proposed a two-stage restoration, beginning with a theatre of varieties and then going to the full lyric theatre. That's the full-scale, large theatre capable of taking in any show, any touring show. Very important, not just for Brighton in general, but specifically perhaps for the Brighton Festival, when there are shows that can't be brought into Brighton. The report was for a group of stakeholders, which included the Council and Historic England and the Theatres Trust, and the Academy Music Group, who were then owners, and the Frank Matcham Society. Part of the idea of that was that it would help to regenerate the old town. And indeed, when the CIC raised some funds, we did pay for this report on behalf of the council for a character statement, which was long overdue, about the Old Town Conservation Area. That led on to a management plan for the same area. part of which involved one of our ideas. This is the boundary between the Hippodrome of Duke's Lane, and there is the area, the access at the back of Duke's Lane. Our idea was to, can we see that? Yes, our idea, oh no, we can't, was to create a lane. But this was our idea for extending Hippodrome House. The blue part is the current footprint, and we were going to build around it to include a studio theatre, a new entrance to the theatre, and so on. And it would be a very flexible theatre. This is a theatre in the round. This is theatre, a thrust stage, which is the sort that the Royal Shakespeare Company likes. There could be a cabaret mode with a flat floor, or there could be the standard lyric theatre with the raked seating. But this is still much like the way it is now. But the important thing is, it still is there now. And the original theatre is still inside. If you take away the bingo bits, it's still there. It is the original theatre is in a terrible condition, but it could be restored. And indeed, most of the major theatre operators in the country have specifically expressed an interest in running it, but not in restoring it. So the problem is, how do you get that done? Well, I'm very pleased that Maxim is actually getting on with the work to at least make the building weatherproof. And we have approached them with our business plan, which shows how it could be a sustainable, viable theatre with a seating capacity of between 1250 and 1500 seats. We've presented this argument to the council in the form of a pre-application planning application, and we have talked to Historic England, and they seem to be very interested in the possibility of doing that. But I hope this isn't the sort of, the sunset of an uncertain future for the place, but it still is uncertain. So if you have any comments, you can email me, david.fisher@brightonhippodrome.co.uk. And if you have an interest in the Regency Society, go to the website regencysociety.org, where there are other recorded talks that you can watch. But thank you very much for watching. And I hope that next time we talk about the Hippodrome, it will be with some positive news about something that will really make it great for the city and for the country. Thank you.